Imagine coming home after a long day, only to find strangers in your backyard, partying as if they owned it. For months she tolerated it, until one bold move changed everything. Margaret never wanted to be that neighbor. She wasn't the type to spy through curtains or complain about minor nuisances. She believed in building a friendly community, waving at passers-by, chatting by the mailbox, even sharing homegrown tomatoes with the couple next door. But one thing she wouldn't compromise on was respect, and lately, it felt like no one on the block had any. It started subtly, a few weeks into summer. In the mornings, she'd spot wet footprints on her patio. At first, she brushed it off, assuming a raccoon had wandered through, until she found a crumpled soda can floating in the deep end. Then came the towels. Not hers, but strangers, casually draped over her lounge chairs as if her backyard had turned into a public pool. She wanted to give the benefit of the doubt. Maybe some kids got confused, mistaking it for a shared space. But one evening, just before sunset, she caught them. 3 teenagers, laughing as they waded through her pool, completely unaware, or unconcerned, that they were trespassing. Margaret didn't yell or overreact. Instead, she slid open her back door and stepped outside. The second they spotted her, their faces went pale. We thought nobody was home," one stammered, scrambling out. Margaret crossed her arms. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Without another word, they bolted, leaving behind soaked towels and a spilled bag of chips littering her deck. She sighed and spent the next 20 minutes cleaning up their mess. As she scooped soggy crumbs from the water, muttering under her breath, Margaret assumed that was the end of it. Surely, they had learned their lesson. She was wrong. By the following week, things had spiraled. It wasn't just teenagers sneaking in after dark anymore, it was entire families. Parents, kids, even grandparents, all helping themselves to her pool as if it were a public attraction. She'd step outside to find inflatable rafts drifting across the water, snack wrappers littering her patio table, and stray flip-flops scattered along the deck. Margaret tried to be reasonable. She taped polite notes to the gate. "Private property. Do not enter." She spoke with a few parents on the street, making it clear she wasn't comfortable with uninvited guests. It made no difference. One afternoon, she spotted a woman lounging in one of her patio chairs, scrolling through her phone behind dark sunglasses while her kids shrieked and splashed in her pool. Margaret approached, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, you're in my backyard." The woman barely glanced up. "Oh, I know. The kids just wanted to cool off. We'll be out soon." Margaret clenched her jaw. "That's not the point. You didn't ask." At last, the woman slid off her sunglasses, looking at Margaret as if she were the unreasonable one. "It's just a pool," she scoffed. "You're not even using it." Margaret felt her chest tighten. The audacity, the entitlement, as if her property, her space, was up for grabs simply because she wasn't outside enjoying it every day. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "It's my pool, and I'd like you to leave." The woman rolled her eyes but gathered her things, calling her kids from the water with a dramatic sigh. "You really don't have to be so uptight." The woman muttered something under her breath. Margaret didn't reply. She didn't need to. She simply stood there, arms crossed, watching as they hastily gathered their belongings and slipped through the gate. They didn't even bother closing it, leaving it ajar like they'd be right back. That was when Margaret knew. Being polite wasn't going to cut it. Things were only getting worse. But she had a plan, and soon her neighbors would regret ever taking her kindness for granted. Margaret tried everything, and she meant everything. She replaced her sign with a bigger one, this time in bold red letters, "Private property." No trespassing. It was ripped down in 2 days. She installed a new lock on the gate. By morning, it dangled uselessly broken. She even called the non-emergency police line, hoping an officer's presence might send message. But when one finally showed up, all he did was shrug. "It's a civil matter, ma'am. If you catch them in the act, you can file a report." Catch them? That was the problem. She didn't want to waste her days lurking behind curtains, waiting for the next entitled family to waltz in like they owned the place. She was 72, not some security guard. But her patience, that was running out. Fast. That evening, she sat on her porch, sipping tea, trying to shake off the frustration. Then movement. Out of the corner of her eye, she spotted a boy no older than 10, scaling her fence with the ease of someone who had done it many times before. He landed softly, glanced around, and whistled. Within seconds, 2 more kids followed. Margaret's fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. Unbelievable. She cleared her throat loudly. The kids froze mid-step. "Well," she said, voice sharp, "since you seem to think you live here, you might as well carry on." The smallest one, maybe 7, actually had the nerve to smile. "Our mom said it's fine," he chirped. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Did she now? The oldest, clearly the ringleader, shuffled uncomfortably. "We'll just be a minute." "No." She pushed herself up from her chair. "You'll leave. Now." For once, they actually listened. The boys scrambled over the fence, vanishing into the neighbor's yard. But Margaret didn't feel victorious. She felt furious. Not at the kids. They were just doing what they were allowed to do. It was the parents. The ones who ignored her notes, dismissed her complaints, and acted like her property was theirs to use whenever they pleased. But she wasn't done. Not even close. Because the real breaking point was still ahead. And after that, there would be no going back. That day, the heat was suffocating, the kind that made the air thick and heavy. Margaret had spent her morning running errands, picking up groceries, and trying, really trying, to ignore the simmering frustration in her chest. She just wanted to come home, unload her bags, and sit in the shade with a cold glass of lemonade. But the moment she pulled into her driveway, she knew peace was not on today's agenda. Music. Loud music. Laughter. Splashing. The unmistakable sound of children shrieking in delight. Margaret's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She stared at her house, her backyard, her space. And yet, it looked nothing like her own. Through the gaps in the fence, she saw them. Dozens of people. This wasn't a few kids sneaking in for a dip. This was a full-blown gathering. Coolers lined her patio like someone had planned a picnic. A grill smoked. Pool floats drifted across the water, some occupied by parents lounging like they belonged there. And in the middle of it all, her. The same woman Margaret had confronted weeks ago, reclining in one of her chairs, sipping from a plastic cup, as if this was her own personal resort. Margaret sat in her car for a long moment, just breathing. This wasn't just disrespectful. This was bold. She grabbed her grocery bags, walked up the steps, deliberately taking her time. And when she pushed open the back door, not one person even noticed. That was what stung the most. Not the music. Not the mess. Not even the kids trampling her flower beds. It was the sheer disregard. As if she was the outsider in her own home. Margaret set her bags down harder than necessary. The sound barely registered over the noise outside. So she stepped forward, right to the edge of her patio. "Excuse me." No one turned. She stepped closer, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I said excuse me." Finally, a few heads turned. The music still blared, but at least some people had the decency to look startled. The woman in the lounge chair sighed, setting down her drink like this was some kind of inconvenience. "Oh, hey, Margaret." Margaret blinked. "Hey." That was all she had to say. Margaret scanned the backyard, the strangers still floating, eating, laughing, acting like nothing was wrong. Something inside her snapped. "You need to leave. All of you." The woman sat up, adjusting her sunglasses. "Come on," she scoffed. "It's just a little fun. No harm, no foul." Margaret let out a short, humorless laugh. "No harm? You broke my lock, ignored my signs, turned my home into a public park." The woman shrugged. "It's a hot day." Margaret's pulse thundered in her ears. She turned to the others, her voice sharp, unwavering. "I'm not asking again. Get out." Finally, people started moving. Kids climbed out of the pool, towels dragging behind them. Adults muttered under their breath, but at least had the sense to start packing up, coolers slammed shut, plastic cups stuffed into trash bags. Margaret didn't budge. She stood firm, watching, waiting. She knew this wasn't over. Even as the last person stepped out, and the gate clicked shut behind them, she knew the disrespect wouldn't stop here. But Margaret had already made up her mind. This was the last time anyone would ever set foot in her pool. And tomorrow, she was going to make damn sure of it. That night, she barely slept. Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, replaying it all. The laughter, the indifference, the way they shrugged off her anger. As if she was the problem. As if wanting control over her own home was unreasonable. She had tried. Really tried. Politeness. Warnings. Even calling the police. Nothing worked. And that's when it hit her. The problem wasn't just the neighbors. It was the pool. As long as it was there, sparkling, inviting, a symbol of summer indulgence, people would keep coming. They'd keep making excuses. Keep ignoring her. Keep taking. So, she'd take something from them. By morning, Margaret had already made the call. The guy on the other end sounded baffled. You want to get rid of it? Completely. That's right, Margaret said. A long pause. Ma'am, do you know how much work that's going to be? For the first time in days, Margaret smiled. Not when they broke her lock. Not when they ignored her signs. Not when they acted like she didn't exist. But now she was smiling. Another pause on the line, then a chuckle. Fair enough. We can start tomorrow. That was all she needed to hear. Margaret spent the rest of the day on her porch, sipping coffee, waiting. She didn't have to wait long. By noon, her neighbor, the same woman who had lounged in her chair like she owned the place, leaned over the fence. Getting some work done? Margaret nodded. Sure am. The woman squinted, noticing the orange tape outlining the pool. What kind of work? Margaret took another sip of coffee. Didn't say a word. By afternoon, the questions turned to rumors. Someone saw her talking to a contractor. Someone else noticed a cement truck scheduled for delivery. And by nightfall, there was a knock at her door. Margaret opened it, keeping her expression neutral. You're not actually, the woman hesitated. You're not getting rid of the pool, are you? Margaret tilted her head. Why do you care? The woman scoffed, crossing her arms. It's such a nice feature. A lot of us enjoy it. Margaret let that sit. A lot of us. Not her. Not Margaret. Us. Exactly, Margaret said at last. And that's the problem. Then she shut the door before the woman could reply. She knew this decision wouldn't be popular. She also didn't care. Because by this time tomorrow, her backyard would no longer be their playground. And she was going to make damn sure of that. By sunrise, the real show had begun. The first truck pulled up just after 8 a.m., a flatbed carrying demolition equipment. 30 minutes later, a second truck arrived, this time with a full crew in reflective vests and hard hats. They moved with purpose, unloading tools, prepping the site. Margaret sat on her porch, arms crossed, watching. And she wasn't the only one. Neighbors started gathering. First a few, then more. They peeked from behind curtains, lingered in driveways, pretended to water their lawns, just for a better look. Then, right on cue, the woman from next door stormed across the lawn, sandals slapping against the pavement. What the hell is this? Margaret didn't even blink. Construction. The woman's voice shot up an octave. You're actually doing it? You're really tearing out the pool. Margaret took a slow sip of coffee. I thought you said it was just a pool. The woman's jaw tightened. You're overreacting. Margaret just smiled. Maybe. But she didn't argue. Didn't explain herself. Because the decision was already made. And now it was too late to stop it. The first roar of machinery shattered the morning silence. A jackhammer split through the tiles, tearing them into jagged shards. The woman flinched. The neighbors watched, stunned. Someone murmured, she's actually doing it. Damn right she was. The destruction was fast. Brutal. By mid-morning, the pristine blue water was gone, leaving behind an empty, gaping crater. The workers didn't hesitate, shoveling, breaking, hauling debris. Margaret watched every second of it. And she savored it. By noon, the complaints started rolling in. Someone, probably the woman next door, called the HOA. Didn't matter. Margaret had already checked the rules. Nothing said she couldn't remove a pool on her own property. Another neighbor tried to argue. That pool was a staple of the community. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Funny, I don't remember installing a community pool. And just like that, the argument died. Because what could they say? They had trespassed. They had ignored her warnings. They had pushed her too far. And now they were paying the price. By sunset, the final truck rolled in. And instead of a pool, Margaret's backyard was now a smooth, flat slab of fresh concrete. No more water. No more lounge chairs. No more pool parties. And most importantly, no more uninvited guests. But Margaret wasn't done yet, because the best part was still coming. The next morning, she stepped outside with her coffee and took a deep breath. For the first time in months, her backyard was quiet. No splashing. No music. No strangers acting like they belonged there. Just her. Exactly the way it should be. She ran a hand over the smooth concrete, still fresh from the day before. Some people would have seen an empty space. A loss. But Margaret? She saw freedom. Of course, the neighbors weren't happy. Some still grumbled when they saw her. Others threw pointed looks in her direction, as if trying to shame her for what she had done. It didn't work. Because, funny enough, no one actually had the guts to say anything to her face. They knew. They knew they had crossed a line. They knew they had pushed too far. And deep down, they knew they had no one to blame but themselves. A few days later, Margaret was planting roses along the edge of her new patio when she heard footsteps. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. The woman from next door. A hesitant throat clear. So, what are you going to do with it? Margaret dusted the soil off her hands, then stood. Haven't decided, she said, glancing over the space. Maybe a garden. Maybe a nice fire pit. Whatever I want, really. The woman shifted her weight. You know, the kids are really disappointed. Margaret turned to her, expression unreadable. Oh, she said, voice even. Then, after a pause. And where were the kids when my signs were ignored? When my locks were broken? When my property was treated like a free-for-all? The woman had no answer for that. Instead, she just exhaled sharply, shook her head, as if Margaret was the unreasonable one, and walked away. Margaret watched her go. Then she turned back to her work. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't bitter. Because she had learned something. People will take whatever they can get away with. They will push, overstep, test the limits of your kindness. And if you don't stop them, they'll just keep pushing. Margaret had spent months waiting for them to respect her space. But in the end, she had to take that respect back for herself. She knelt down, pressing a rose bush into the dirt, and smiled to herself. She might not have a pool anymore, but what she had now was so much better, because it was hers. And only hers. Have you ever dealt with entitled neighbors? How did you handle it? Tell us your story in the comments. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unbelievable real-life stories.